So it's 1 minute past. I think we'll get going if that's okay with everybody. So just to say as a point of note that we're recording the session to share with people afterwards. So we're just going to mention that as a disclaimer at the beginning. And I just wanted to welcome everybody to today's session on why and how to join an NHS Trust Board hosted by Nurole. So I'm Mark Bates and I'll be chairing the conversation today. So I'm going to give you a quick introduction on Nurole, then I'll introduce the panelists and then we'll start the question and answer session. And the aim of today's session is for you to come away with an understanding of the impact that you can have on a NHS Trust Board and how to approach the application process in order to give yourself a really strong chance of joining a board. And then we'll talk about what new NHS Trust Boards are looking for. So on your screen, you can see there's a chat function and the Q&A and a raise your hand function. Now, I'd encourage you to use the Q&A button because you can ask questions and other people can upvote the questions that they see that they would like to see answered. So that's the formalities at the beginning. So Nurole, we are a specialist of finding board talent for organisations up and down the country and across the world. And the reason why we work with NHS Trust Boards is because we are incredibly passionate about working with anchor organisations up and down the country. So we work with charities, universities, housing associations, etc. And we're really passionate about working with people that want to enhance the communities in which they live. And we've got a really good track record in doing so. We have a wonderful technology which provides fantastic candidate reach. So we have 60,000 people in our membership. But we underpin that with a traditional search process. So we've got collectively 200 years of experience within the traditional search processes within Nurole. And all of this increases diversity, not just of backgrounds, of characteristics, of outlook and experiences, because it's a natural byproduct of having a very large candidate pool, but you thereby increase the number of people from underrepresented groups. Before I introduce the panelists, it's just worth mentioning that those panelists come from NHS Trust Boards, and I'll let them explain what they are more broadly when they're introduced. But the NHS is a gargantuan organisation, a complex system, and I'm going to share with you in the chat group some links to NHS Trust sort of aid memoirs, really, and to give you an understanding about what they are. So that's a bit of further reading. But there are things like integrated care boards, NHS England, system working. You'll hear all of these phrases, I'm sure, throughout the conversation. And if there's any questions to that, please do ask. But there will be some further reading, which I think gives you a bit of a broad overview and understanding of the concepts that we're talking about. So today I'm joined by Clancy Murphy, who's a non-executive director at Hampshire Hospitals, NHS Foundation Trust, and Phil Wilbraham, who's the NED at Epsom and St Helier NHS Trust. So it'd be good to introduce yourselves. Shall we start with Clancy?
Thanks, Mark. Good afternoon, everyone. So as Mark said, I'm a non-executive director. I sit on the board of the Hampshire Hospitals Foundation Trust. That is a board which looks after 3 hospitals in the mid-Hampshire area: Winchester, Basingstoke and Andover. We're a foundation trust, which if you go and read about from the King's Fund, it means something slightly different to some of the other trusts. We have a little bit more independence. My background is I joined the trust in August 22. I had no connection at all to the NHS before I joined the board. My background was I've worked for 30 years across numerous organisations, but most latterly as a global chief people officer for a defence company, which was a FTSE 250 company. So I've got a range of different experiences, but all really in the people space and what you would think of as HR. So that's my background.
Shall I go next way? So good afternoon all. I'm Phil Wilbraham, and as Mark said, a non-exec director at Epsom and St Helier NHS Trust. We're a regular trust, we're not a foundation trust. So and again, there are slight differences, but foundation trusts have governors as well as non-exec directors. But interestingly, Epsom and St Helier has just joined up with St George's in Tooting, and we formed a group which is St George's and Epsom St Helier, and we're in the process of forming a single board. But those two organisations will stay as individual organisations. St George's a foundation trust and Epsom St Helier a regular trust. I'd never worked in the NHS before either. My background is actually construction and project management, and spent 20 years delivering projects at Heathrow. I'm a civil engineer by background. I'm also a non-exec director now of two construction companies, and I still work part-time for Heathrow. So I've got a portfolio of things that I do, which allows me to, as well as the NHS, to really have a sort of rich portfolio of things which actually do overlap, and that's one of the things we might get into. It's not all about hospitals. You can bring your experience from all sorts of places to the NHS.
Thanks both. So just a bit of a brief outline of the topics. So we're going to talk for about 20 minutes on what happens on an NHS Trust Board. So things like challenges and how boards are trying to solve those challenges, and typically what boards look like and feel like. And then we'll talk about the application process for about 15 minutes, and ideally what experiences boards are looking for, etc., etc. So I'll let Clancy and Phil sort of go with that. What happens on an NHS Trust Board? If you can answer that in the best way you possibly can.
I'm happy to start, Phil, and then you can chime in. So I have worked on a very large number of boards, both private companies, PLCs, and private equity, and I've been a senior advisor. I currently run my own consulting practice. It really surprised me that the NHS approach is so complicated. But when you get into it, you realise that it sort of needs to be. My thoughts would be the NHS is probably one of the most complex structures you will become part of, and that is why the board process and the board approach is as complicated as it is. And probably the most real example I can think of is I was working in a PLC, a global PLC in the defence sector when I joined the board. Our typical board pack was about 100 pages, and our chairman would be up in arms. This was so long, it took so long to get through. And I turned up at my first board meeting for Hampshire Hospitals in September 2022, having read a 900-page board pack. And that did not include the committee notes. So it's very complicated. And you start off coming in going, wow, I can't believe that they're so inefficient, all these papers, blah, blah, blah. And the more you get into it, the more you realise that actually this is a hugely complex scenario, which has been built up over years and years and years. And the difference between that and a commercial organisation is that the NHS has not had the benefit of being able to stand back and say, look, we just need to do this differently. Let's do it in a different way. So what you're becoming part of is a heritage organisation which has been built and built and built in a public sector manner, which has then become very complicated. And what you then might describe as one of our biggest wicked problems, those of you who enjoy that type of language, it's multiple challenges. There's no one way to succinctly define the challenges that the NHS faces, and there is no one way to solve it. And that means that the challenges facing individual boards are multiple, complex, and often very acute. So I think that's where I would start, Phil. I don't know where you would go with it.
Well, that's fantastic, Clancy. I suppose what I sort of add, if you think about today, the sort of issues that NHS boards are discussing today as to how to square the circle between quality of patient care and performance and money. And money is tight in the NHS, and that's something that is very acute. But targets are set, which are asking people to do more and more with less. And of course, quality of care is absolutely the one thing that everybody wants. And so, as a non-exec, the opportunity is to really support the executive to make good decisions when they're trying to square those circles. And it can be, it depends where you end up working. Some of the trusts are actually in fact, buildings and infrastructure they use are really getting quite old as well. And you will all have read about the new hospital programme in the press. That is a fantastic thing, which will deliver new infrastructure, but it's probably delivering it a little slower than some of the trusts expected. And so it's really, and for me, it's the basics like that which are really important to motivate the people who work in the trust to give the best they can every day. And the other thing, again, you'll read about in the press, whatever, there are shortages of people in the NHS, and this is a reality. And one of the things that surprised me, because I worked in the private sector my whole career, and it's not abnormal to be running at vacancy rates of sort of 10 to 15%, which seems to me to be a lot. And it's one of the things that, again, as a NED, I'm constantly pressing to understand why this happens and why and how we could do something about it, and trying to encourage, you know, let's say some more interesting ideas as to how these things can be worked through. Because again, if you go to work and you find that you're 15% down before you even start, that can make it a very difficult day. And there are obviously other issues on at the moment, like, you know, industrial action, etc. But what I'd say is the beauty of the boards is that they are quite structured. There are certain things you have to do every year. And when you get into things like creating strategy with the execs, it really is, you know, it's good, interesting work. The work is done steadily, but there's a lot of, you know, NED input, NED ideas, NED support, NED challenge, and you can certainly then see a strategy evolving, which hopefully will, you know, for the next 5 years, allow your trust to improve. So there's a lot of opportunity there, as well as a lot of day-to-day quite hard work. And as Clancy said, the amount of information you get sent to you is phenomenal, because below the main boards there are committees, and as a NED you may sit on 1, 2 or 3 of those committees. There'll be one probably concentrate on people issues, one on finance issues, performance, quality, etc. And that's where, again, lots of work is done, quite long meetings to go through, to gain assurance that the things that we have to assure are being done.
Yeah. Thank you. Go on. I was just going to ask a very quick question, but please do go ahead. My question is just for the prompting later is, you talked about the exec directors, and it would be useful, I think, at some point to talk about the relationship between the non-executives and the executive community.
I'm happy to talk a bit about that. Actually, it was the point I was going to make. So I'm part of a foundation trust, and when you're in a foundation trust, you have extra layers of governance, and for us that is our board of governors. So there's a relationship between the board of governors, who are made up by local people from the local community who volunteer to do this. They're voluntary, and typically will be towards the latter end of their working lives. Our chairman of our governors is well into his 80s, so they are super passionate about what's going on in their community, and they provide a slightly different view of the care that's being provided by the trust. And then you have the executive team, the executive directors, and then you have the non-executive directors. And then you'll have things like charitable trusts and all those other things. And as Phil mentioned, there'll be lots of subcommittees made up of members from each of those. So in my particular foundation trust, we've got governors, executives, non-executives, and then trustees, because we have a charitable trust as well, and they could be different people. So you've got all of those things to work through. What I have been really surprised by, and it's been fantastic, is the close relationship between each of those groups. And my take on that is, perhaps in contrast to some commercial organisations, there is no question about the purpose of why we're all there. Everybody is there for exactly the same reason, and that is patient care. And there is no debate about that. So that everyone's looking in that direction. It's about quality of patient care. Outside of that, everyone has a functional role to play in delivering that. It might be making sure, as Phil says, we've got enough resources, or they're properly trained, or they're properly engaged, or the buildings are fit for purpose, or we've got the right equipment, or we're delivering the care appropriate for our communities. But this sense of purpose is really interesting, because my experience with my board has been, I've never worked with such an amazing group of people, because they are all so rigidly focused on it's about patients. The quality of the other non-execs is quite extraordinary. It would appear that the NHS attracts people who fundamentally want to be involved in supporting it. And you know, a word to everyone, you don't do it for the money. This is not the best paid board role you're ever going to have. It really, you know, it's a very modestly paid position as a non-exec compared to what you might get somewhere else. But to be fair, our executives are also paid in a very modest way because of the way government pay scales work. So a lot of it is about this passion for providing brilliant care for patients, and that runs through all of the different levels. I have found that my executive colleagues have been extraordinarily generous with their time, with their energy, with their creativity. And as Phil mentioned there, the levers that you have in a commercial organisation, if you're an executive, around engaging colleagues just don't really exist in the NHS. You can't pay people more money, you can't give them more holiday. It's just, you can't do that. But what you can do is work really, really closely with all your colleagues to find out what will make a big difference to them. And it's amazing some of the things that make a big difference, and it's amazing what you can do with nothing. And that does run through the executive teams as well as throughout the organisation. And I think that is really inspiring, and certainly something that makes me quite passionate about the role I'm doing, even though there are many, many issues with it. I did ask one of the outgoing non-execs last year how she coped with these 900 pages, and her reply was chocolate. So I'm also crediting the NHS with the expansion of my waistline, which probably is counterproductive.
So I would just agree with all of that, Clancy. I think I've never come across a group of people who all care so much, and they absolutely, the purpose is clear. It is all about patient care, but they care about each other as well. So colleagues really do care about, and the time they will give is incredible, actually. And there's a lot of goodwill in the NHS. I think some of it was sucked out during COVID, but there is still a lot of goodwill in the NHS. And I think as non-execs, we can, coming from different experiences and backgrounds, we can provide some sort of well, sometimes challenge to say, actually, we perhaps need to be a bit more commercial about this, a bit more, a bit more challenging about this, because there can be a situation, well, this is the NHS, and so it's always going to be like this. But actually, it is a massive organisation with ultimately hundreds of thousands of people working, but most trusts have got thousands of people working for them. And if you've got thousands of people working, there's always improvement you can make. And as a NED, I think it's absolutely critical that we keep on that continuous improvement sort of journey, to be honest, to encourage the NHS to gently improve. And also, if there is the opportunity for transformational change, whether that's building a new hospital or putting in a new IT system, and goodness me, we certainly need some IT systems in some of the hospitals, and there are still, in certainly Epsom and Helier, most of the work is still done on paper, and we are putting in a new IT system. But then the challenge for a NED is to ensure that we get the best out of that new IT system, that we really, assure that the right people are trained to use it, and it just doesn't become a thing that actually takes more time to use rather than the old system. So there are, again, opportunities, and I think it's really important that we keep on challenging, but also giving examples of how this has worked in different places. And a lot of the non-execs have worked in large companies and in different sectors, and some of the experience is extremely similar. The example I always use is actually line management, because I think line management and yearly appraisals, 6-monthly appraisals probably could be done quite a lot better in the NHS, and it's something at Heathrow we spend a lot of time improving. And when you get that to work, the communication from the top to the bottom and the bottom to the top improves immediately, and that would be a real boon for certainly the NHS Trust I'm working in.
I think what you're highlighting there, Phil, is some really excellent points about the role of us as NEDs. We are not here to tell the executive team what to do. We are here to help them understand how to create focus and to pick the things that are going to have the biggest impact for them and their colleagues, and to really help them develop a systems way of thinking, so that when we do agree a change or something which is going to make a big difference, that they can understand how to work that through the system. And that's really where your commercial experience comes in. I know that you've had huge commercial experience with big projects in big complex environments, and I've done something a little bit similar where I've worked, and I think that's really what you're bringing as a NED. You're being calm and measured and reflective because you're not living it day to day, and you're able to stand back and say, okay, we just need a bit of focus. When I joined the trust, I discovered that there were more than 200 different projects running, and these were big live projects, and there's 6,000 people work in the trust. So that's a lot of projects. And then I discovered that was pretty typical. We are a very typical trust. And so part of the role of the board, and particularly the NEDs on the board, is to help work through that and say, okay, so what's going to make the biggest difference? And how do we focus and prioritize and not forget the rest, but prioritize these? and help move that forward, and what might that change look like? And that really is a very big part of the role. And what I've found is to help the executives to be brave in their thinking, not in what they might do, but what they might not do. And that goes back to your point, Phil, about being a little bit tougher with colleagues or the wider community about what isn't going to happen, as well as what might happen. And that does take bravery, and that's really hard. But I think that is part of the NED role.
Thank you both. I think we could move into some questions very soon, but one question I think might be useful for people to, or the answer to that people might want to hear is the different backgrounds that you work with in the NHS community. So, for example, Phil, you talked about digital and IT, and then you talked about transformation, and you talked about estates. Could you just bring to life, the kinds of backgrounds of people that you work with? And that's addressed to both of you.
It's very broad. So, and that's one of the interesting things. So, and it always things mean slightly different things, different places. So there is the obvious clinical side, if you like, where there are doctors, consultants, nurses, but obviously there's all sorts of levels within that, but also all sorts of specialisms in that. And certainly one of the things I get to do, which is fascinating, is to interview consultants. So we always have one NED chairing the interview panel, and it's really, really interesting because you get involved in all sorts of clinical specialties, which I would, I know very, very little about. So there's the clinical side of it, if you like, and then there are also the executive team. Some have come from the clinical side, and some haven't. They are effectively professional leaders, and they're leaders who've probably worked in different areas in the NHS, and then come through to get involved in leadership in a trust. There are, of course, the other side of it. There is all the estates and facilities, and estates and facilities is massively wide ranging, from actually looking after fabric of buildings to doing the catering, the portering, and a huge, and then there's patient transport. It sits in there. So there are an enormous number of different things, and all these bits need to work together. And then there is a debate also about whether everything's insourced or outsourced, and that goes, as like in many businesses, that conversation goes on. And generally these are big organisations in a local community as well. So there's a sort of anchor organisation, accountability. And so representing our local community is really important, and I think it is, and having the knowledge of how many people are locals who work at the hospital, etc., and how one can encourage the right people in the local area to actually come and work in their anchor institution is. So there's a huge range of people, Mark, who you will come across, and the other beauty of being an NED is that you can go and walk around the building, walk and meet people, etc., and you get to learn an awful lot about the breadth and the massive diversity that is the NHS team.
Yeah, can I just segue into the questions, if that's okay? Because I think the question that I think has been upvoted the most at this stage follows on neatly from the comment that you've just made. So the question is, I was told by a headhunter for the NHS that NEDs are also sought from the local area, which means London-based candidates face much higher competition for London NHS and NED roles than perhaps regional candidates for vacancies near them.
So, from my perspective, yes, that was I wouldn't say a requirement. It was a thing that was definitely welcomed. I actually, my sort of local hospital is the neighbouring trust. So I'm in the neighbouring trust to Epsom and St Helier, but I'm very close to both Epsom Hospital and St Helier Hospital. I think it is useful being local for lots of reasons. You understand the locality, the diversity, the communities around. It also means you can get to the hospital very easily as well, which or the hospitals, and I think that does help, because certainly post-COVID, we try to do most things in person that need to be done in person now. So there's less, and certainly the chair of the board I work with, she likes us either all in person or all online. We're not very good at hybrid, but again, I suspect there's many different ways of doing this. But yeah, there is, I think, it's good to have a local background and to understand. And I think that I don't think it's ever set down as a sort of rigid requirement, but it's definitely something that's looked for.
I think I would add to that, Mark, which is, if you want to join a trust, you have to have a reason to want to join. Now, mine is a little bit like Phil's. My children were born in one of the hospitals. My father passed away in one of the hospitals. I'm local. I've lived here all my life. So that was quite easy to explain. However, a number of our NEDs are not local, but they had a reason for wanting to join this trust. One of them because of the diversity agenda that we have, and we bring in a lot of people from overseas. We are super successful at it. We're a bit of a flagship for the government on bringing in staff from overseas. So that's one of our NEDs is not from the area, but has a particular interest in that and could demonstrate it. And we have another NED who has a different reason for being involved, for other skill sets that he brings, and was very clear, able to articulate that. So I think if you are local, it's very easy to articulate and it's very easy to make that link. If you're not, I think the point about you need to be able to get to the hospitals quite easily. It's pretty important. But if you have a particular reason for that vacancy being of real interest to you, then you need to be able to articulate it. And I don't think that will go against you. And there are limited numbers of people in each area. London is the one where there are probably a much bigger population to pull from. But in the local trusts, that there are fewer, and therefore don't be put off, I would suggest.
Yeah, thank you. And I think it's probably worth me just mentioning, from my perspective, having worked with several trusts up and down the country, is there are constitutions that each NHS trust is adheres to, and we've seen increasingly that they are moving from a very strict constitution, which requires you to be living and having your postcode in the applicable area, moving to a rest of England or etc. So they recognise this problem. And indeed, I had a conversation with the chair, actually from the commercial sector, who said, it strikes me that I wouldn't ever in the commercial world limit the pool of people to where they live, because I want the best people and the best talent for my board. So I think this is an ongoing discussion, and on a case-by-case basis, each trust has their own requirements. And I think the regional trusts, as you say, and the pools of people, is a very important one. I'm going to move into the other questions, because actually I think some of this might then relate to the associate NED role. One of the questions is around the associate NED scheme. Are all of these associate roles advertised, and how will we find these roles? I may just quickly answer that for 10 seconds before I move on to the other one. There is a website which I can share on this chat afterwards. All of the roles are advertised on there. Different search firms will be used to find those roles. But there is a link where NHS are advertising at any one point, so I can share that in the link. Just under a few questions with upvote. I think this is a really interesting one, actually. So most NED roles are advertised as 2 days per month. In reality, what is the time commitment?
It's a really good question, and it depends a little bit on how you view what you're going to do. I think I've got 4 NED roles and only one in the NHS, and the NHS is the most time-consuming of the NED roles that I have. It could be all-encompassing. You could spend an awful lot of time, but you have to decide what you're going to do and where you're going to get involved. And obviously at the start, it'll take more time, because you'll probably be, being inducted and learning how things work. But then your chair will probably say, right, I'd like you to work on this committee and this committee. And then you've got a decision to make whether you want to attend other committees or not. And I certainly the chair I work with, she is absolutely of the view that we, less is more. And I do believe less is more here as well. So I think you need to be really clear what you're going to do, the time you're going to give it, and then give that time joyfully. But I wouldn't recommend then sitting through lots of other things, which there are other NEDs already doing, because you all come together at the board where the sort of, cabinet accountability comes back together again, and you have the right then to chip in if you want to, if you think things are not as you thought they were going to be. So I would say it's more than 2 days a month, but if you're spending more than probably 4 days a month, you may be getting too involved. I don't know what Clancy thinks.
It's an interesting one, isn't it? A 900-page board pack doesn't get read in an evening. And But the more you get into your role, the more you realise what you need to read and what you don't. If you're a member of a committee, then you don't need to read those committee papers again because you've read them already. Talk to your other NEDs. I spend an awful lot of time talking to the other NEDs and therefore don't need to read their 200-page pack on the Finance and Investment Committee. They'll guide me to, you must make sure you've read this bit, but the rest of it I've just explained to you or we'll cover at the board. So you start to get wise as to what is required and what isn't. I would completely agree with Phil that you can choose how you do this. My advice on how much you get involved might be slightly different. The trust I work for is very good on staff engagement, so they regularly run events like treat trolleys around the wards and safety walks and various other things, which the NEDs are always invited to be involved in. And I do tend to take up one of those probably every couple of months, because it means you meet staff and you meet them informally rather than a formal session where staff are invited. And I think that's super helpful because it gives you a feel for what's really happening on the ground. So I would say my contracted time is 2 days a month. I probably give 4 days a month quite regularly, and occasionally perhaps 5. I work independently. I run my own consulting business, so I have the ability to do that. When I was previously employed, then I had an agreement with my employer, it was 2 days a month, and if I wanted to do more, it was in my own time. So it was very easy to keep it to 2 days a month of time off from work, and then other bits and bobs I sort of fitted in around. So I think the point you made, Phil, is compared to other NED roles, you will probably find this far more absorbing, and there will be far more opportunities to be involved and be invited to be involved than you will ever find with a commercial board, who frankly are just happy you turn up for the board and your job is done. The NHS doesn't work like that. So they will pull as much time as you're prepared to give. So you need to be able to set boundaries.
Thank you. I'm just going to move on to applications shortly, and I promise that each of these questions will be answered, if not in this webinar, will be answered afterwards in the written form. But there's a couple of questions which have a theme, which is previous NED experience a prerequisite? And the next one is, my experience so far has been that recruiters hired to fill NED roles are somewhat dismissive if you've not been in the C-suite in your exec career. Now, we had a question around associate NEDs. I just wonder if it's worth explaining in your experience. I'm more than happy to talk about associate NEDs and the kind of backgrounds that people come from, but is that just worth a couple of minutes of time here in this chat?
Yeah, Clancy, do you want to start or?
Well, it's quite difficult for me to comment because I've been in the C-suite for probably 15 years and I've sat on other boards, so I don't know how I can add to that. It wasn't particularly hard to find an NHS role. It was just waiting for the right location to come up. So I don't think I can add an awful lot to that, Mark, because I wasn't in that position, because I had other experience. Phil, I don't know where you are with it.
So it's really interesting because I think if I hadn't had some other experience apart from my executive role, I think it might have been more difficult. So I'm also a pension trustee, for instance, and have chaired a pension trustee scheme for some time. So that was deemed to be good, and I've chaired a couple of things in the construction industry. So this was my first formal NED role, where I'm actually a non-exec director, but I had done other things which could show that as well as sitting on an executive board, I was capable of doing things with different, different breadth, if you like, and different sort of skill sets. So I think breadth is quite important, and to show that you are somebody who's interested in things, as well as your direct work line, if you like. The associate NED program, yeah, we have associate NEDs, and it tends to be because we've got, I can't remember the exact number, there's so many NEDs who are voting NEDs, if you like, and then it's good to bring in associates who may be succession for voting NEDs, or maybe just getting a bit of experience and they're going to be a voting NED somewhere else. So it's something that, and I think we've got 2 associate NEDs on our board at the moment.
Yeah, and I'll wrap up on this particular one. Associate NEDs, in my experience, we're working with the trust at the moment to find two of them. And they're really keen, actually, that they come from different backgrounds and experiences than what you might call a traditional non-executive director. And we are encouraged that people who, they've got experience from a strategic perspective, but they may not have been a chief executive of a global business or a managing director or whatever. It's they may bring other experiences which are really useful. So I would certainly encourage anyone listening to this that from if you're experienced, if you're looking for an associate NIP role, feel free to reach out to the trust or to the people running the search, because you'll be surprised at how interested they may be in your experience, because they want to diversify their board in outlook and experience. Just conscious of time, and I'm going to move into the application process, because I think this is hugely important for people listening. Both, tell me a bit around the application process. And you both talked about coming from the commercial sectors into the NHS. How did you find them?
Phil and I have talked about this in the background. Yeah.
Shall I? I'll start. So for me, it was fascinating, because I had worked in the private sector for crikey 40 years, and then all of a sudden was thinking about this NED role, and I hadn't really filled an application form, written a letter, attended an interview, actually had my references taken up, and so it's a formal process, which is absolutely right. It should be, because it's a very important role in the public sector. But it's slightly different to what I experienced in the private sector. It's the NHS is a huge organisation. The trusts are huge. It's the process doesn't always run, immensely smoothly. You can, things can arrive late or whatever, and it's things get lost, and it's really important that all the paperwork is ultimately in place, and so that will continue on. But what I found interesting, because through the process, I was able to meet or talk to, because I did it 3 years ago, during COVID, and so. But I was able to talk to some non-exec directors through the process, talk to some exec directors before we got to sort of formal interview stage. The interview stage can involve more than one interview. There's also quite often presentations asked for, or sort of little workshop type things with other stakeholders. So there's quite a lot of ways of doing it. It's but it is. What sort of surprised me was the formality of the process and the rigor, actually. But then on reflection, when you think about it, it's that is absolutely right. And something I've learned since I've become a non-exec director is that the governance of these sort of processes is incredibly important, because it then gives you the confidence that you are getting the right people, such that your governance will then work. And so it was a fascinating process, but I certainly enjoyed it and didn't get too stressed about it. You definitely don't want to get too stressed about it. You want to run with it and be open about it, etc., rather than get stressed that the process isn't necessarily always going as you thought it was going.
I think, and to really confirm what Phil said, you should expect a panel interview. Do not expect a one-to-one interview. That's not how it works. Because I joined a foundation trust, there were multiple panel interviews, including governors as well as executives and trustees. You should expect to have something along the lines of a case study or a discussion group or something to talk about. Because the organisations are quite large and because they are not always brilliantly coordinated, expect the unexpected. So, for example, I turned up for the first part of my interview day, and it was a whole day, expecting to be asked about a particular topic, to be told actually I was to present for 20 minutes. And that was as I walked into the room. So you sort of, I think Phil's advice is spot on. Stay calm. What are they looking for in an ed? They want someone who's calm, measured, reflective, able to sort of go with what's going on. And so expect lots of people in the room. Expect things to perhaps change a little bit from what you were briefed on, because things do change. Expect to be talking quite extensively about your broad commercial experience, not just your functional area. You might be a finance director, or you might be an HR person, or you might be an engineer like Phil, or a project lead. They probably aren't going to ask you about that. They will be more interested in your broad commercial approach, systems, collaboration. How would you? And actually, a lot of the NHS works on really thinking about the detail of what's going on. And the best advice I was given when I was approaching, it was a case study, was people will be interested in your detailed thinking as well as your approach to the whole picture, and that's quite a difficult balance to get. So the positives were, in the interview experience, I met about 30 people. So keep that in mind. That might be excessive for other trusts, but you're going to meet a lot of people. There will be a lot of questions. It will be quite systematic. If you're in a panel, they will all have a chance to ask you questions. It will go on for a very long time, but that is just part of how the NHS works, and it's about being able to demonstrate your clarity of, and calmness under that pressure. The other great piece of advice I was given is, what is your elevator pitch? Because at some point, one of those 25 or 30 people will say, why do you want to do this? And you won't be given 2 hours to explain. So rehearsing those 4 sentences as to why you want to do that, probably more important than any other commercial role. And a bit like Phil, the last time I'd had an interview before last August was when I took my first graduate job. So it was quite the shock.
Thank you. I'm just going to go to a question, actually, because it reflects back on a comment that Phil made around the conversations he had with people during the application process. But usually when applying for a role, you would speak to members of the recruiting panel in advice. Is this appropriate for NED and ANED roles, or is that more through people like Mark in this scenario? So I'll just give a 10-15 seconds on that. Absolutely, yes. We encourage people to talk to people within the trust. Absolutely, it's definitely worth having a chat with people like me, and it's probably worth doing that in the first instance, just so we can funnel the admin really from the trust's perspective, and we can organise diaries, etc., etc. So yes, absolutely. I think it's really key. It's one of the major, I think the major facets of NHS recruitment is talking to people. It's seen as a bit of a prerequisite.
I think that to add to that, Mark, NHS roles are publicly advertised. So it's not a secret that they'll be recruiting for this role. So that's the first thing. So you can talk to people. I can see that the trust is advertising because they'll have seen it too. NHS trusts are part of your local community. It's really unlikely you won't know someone who works for the trust. They might be a porter, they might be a volunteer who works on reception at the hospice, or it might be a consultant or even a member of the board. I just found it hugely helpful to talk to anyone I could about, I understand the trust looking for a new non-exec. Tell me a bit about what it's like to work there, because it's all public, isn't it? There's no secrecy involved. They will be publicly advertised and anyone can see them. So that was really helpful. And the counter to that is just take everything you've heard and put it all together. Don't take one person's view, because you might talk to a porter who's had a particularly bad day because the resurfacing work in the car park hasn't been finished and it was all very bumpy or whatever. But you need to have a bigger picture. But so many people will work there, and you will know some of them, or will know people who know some of them. So I think that was super helpful.
Thank you. Just wonder if it's worth going into the written application process, because as we know, it's the first step in the application. Is there any advice that you would give to people around the information that they have to provide to get into an interview setting?
So my experience there, what was asked for was a CV and a letter, if you like, or a supporting statement. And so the CV is probably relatively straightforward because people probably have CVs, but I want to make sure the right things come out. If you've got experience of working in other places than your exec career, make sure that that's highlighted so people can see it. But I think the supporting statement is a bit like Clancy was saying about your final pitch or your elevator pitch. I think it's really important to write, and I would always say less is more here as well. So I wouldn't write 6 pages, but I would never write 6 pages about anything. So, but that's but some people like to do that, which is fine. It's just I think some real clarity, probably on 1.5 pages, of why you want to do it, what your broad experience you could bring is, and how that experience could benefit the trust, is probably what this comes down to. And I think that can probably be put into 3 or 4, reasonably sensibly length paragraphs. And so I think if you can get, and I spent quite a lot of time on that, because that then allowed me to have the clarity, so I could read that before I went for the interview, the panel interview, and the very question Clancy said was asked to me, why do you want to do this? And of course, you should be able to summarise what's on that page and a half to explain why you want to do this.
Yeah. I think I would back that up, Phil. It took me a very long time to write it, and I just distilled it eventually into 3 chunks, if you like. Why do I want to do this? Why do I think I can help? And why would I make a good NED for this particular trust? So the broader, why am I interested in the NHS? Then the why do I think I'd be additive? What skills do I bring? And then why specifically this? So, but it does take an awful lot of time to write it. It's not an easy thing to do.
Yeah, and from my perspective, as someone who reads applications, it's hugely important. The bit around the beginning in terms of why you want the job. My advice would be, look at the NHS is afforded with great information. There's lots of it, but it's there and it's accessible. You can find trust values, you can find their mission, who they help, what services they deliver, the systems that they're part of, etc. So you can find out all of that information. And actually, it's really impressive that if you can get your articulation of why you want the job and match it to their values, it is always really, really helpful. I'm going to sort of move to a wrap up very shortly, because I think we've got some unanswered questions. Is there anything else that you both want to talk about the application process? Any hints or tips or any other pieces of practical advice that people who are interested in applying for NED roles might want to hear?
So the only thing I think I would add, Mark, is do read around how the trust works in the sort of greater NHS. So whether it's integrated care boards, it's a normal trust or it's a foundation trust. What does NHS England do? What does the CQC do? There are an enormous number of acronyms, and I think it really does help if you've got a bit of a view of how it actually fits together, because most of the people who you'll be talking to will be very clear that they understand all of that, and I suspect they understand 80% of this, and it's absolutely fair to ask questions about it. But I think it's worth doing a bit of research into how it all fits together, because I think it just gives you more context, which will probably give you more confidence when you're answering some, as Clancy said, some fairly regular questions which are already being pre-prepared, but they are, it's a process. But if you can then got the right context to answer that question, I think it really helps.
I think really understanding the context that the trust currently faces is super important. So, for example, the trust that I am part of was not impacted by the first nurses' strike, but has been massively impacted by the junior doctors and consultants' strike. And that was really about how the voting worked and the turnout and all those sort of things. So if you went in, well, obviously you had this huge issue with the nurses' strikes. Well, we didn't. And that wasn't the issue. We had a much bigger issue, which was something else. So reading local press and local information and press releases, finding, joining the group on Twitter or on Facebook, they tend to be quite active on social media, will give you a real insight as to what the challenges are today at a slightly more micro and local level. But those will be the things in people's minds. And to your point, Phil, the team you'll meet live and breathe these challenges every day. And so they will know the 4 or 5 big things currently impacting the organisation. And it would be really helpful if you had those in mind, so that you do sound like you are clued into what the specific problems are, rather than the more generic, the NHS wider problems, something a little bit more specific. And there might be some good news stuff in there as well. There might have been some successes. One of the things that the trust I work for is very, very good at is the local community engagement. So launching things like the opportunity to become an intern to a doctor as part of the Duke of Edinburgh scheme for local schools. That's hugely innovative. It's government backed. It's been super popular. How interesting is that? So just having a few of those local things in mind, as well as the bigger picture stuff, and certainly an understanding of the system, will really help. And it's all publicly available. You can find it all. The King's Fund is super helpful for the wider context.
Yeah, and as I mentioned already, we'll share some of the useful reading in this chat afterwards. I want to spend the last 10 minutes going through unanswered questions, if that's okay. So in the space of that, I've got 12 open ones at the moment in 10 minutes. So we're going to need a short period of time in each. Perhaps maybe suggest one of you take one and the other, maybe chip in if you can. But can you give some examples of those small things that make a difference?
Small things that make a difference to us as board members or to our colleagues on the staff?
I'm going to make a presumption that it's to the trust. So I'll repeat it. Can you give some examples of those small things that make a difference? I think this was in reflection to a conversation that was taking place earlier, but I think the essence of the question was thus.
So I think for me, Mark, this is getting the basics right. So but it's things like knowing you're going to get a car parking space, knowing whether you've got to pay for it or not, knowing that your laptop will work, there are an enormous amount of basics in the NHS which I think could be improved, and it's things like that which allow people to arrive at work in the right frame of mind, because most people jump out of bed, want to do a great day's work, but if you get ground down in the first 2 hours because you couldn't park your car, so you had to go and take it somewhere else, or the bus didn't drop you off where you thought it was going to, then you get there and the laptop's not working. It's these sort of things which I think a little bit more time could probably be spent on to really smooth out people's everyday work.
Thank you. The answer to this question I know can be very big, but how do you feel the pandemic has affected the trusts you work with?
I think, of course, it affects us massively, but interestingly, some very interesting lessons were learned. So during the pandemic, the funding for the NHS changed. So funding was made available in a way that it hadn't been made before because this was unprecedented. And that meant quite a lot of things flowed weirdly, rather more easily than they had done outside of the pandemic. So things like resourcing, overtime, extra staff, facilities, all those things actually became much more available. Now, they were at the expense, to be clear, of other stuff not happening. So this wasn't universally good, but we learned some lessons from that. What happens if we divert this from here to here? What we also learned was that because of the impacts of the pandemic, we had hot wards and cold wards. So wards where there was the virus was present and wards where it was not. And how do we keep patients separate? That led to an awful lot of ward movements. So facilities being relocated, moved around, this ward moved to here. And that actually had a huge impact on staff in a way we hadn't anticipated. Staff don't like moving to new areas, new locations. They were super adaptable, but we learned some lessons about impact on engagement. And Phil talked about knowing that you've got a parking space, knowing your laptop works, but actually knowing where you're going to be working that day is a huge one as well. So the pandemic affected the trust hugely. There were some positives. We learned some good stuff. We also learned some stuff which wasn't so good. But actually, some of the practices that we learned through pandemic, we have kept. So it's all every day's a learning day. And I think, of course, everyone was impacted. Financially, it will take a very long time to recover, and that's not just the trust I work in. That is the global system, because you have backlogs of patients. We now have massive backlogs on elective care. You have huge waiting times in A&E, and that is stuff that will take a very long time to recover from. So yes, that is the legacy impact.
Thank you. I'll move on to the next question in the interest of time, but I know Phil's trust will have been equally as impacted. What are your liabilities as a non-executive director in these environments? Quick answer on that, please.
It's good. I mean, it is normal director responsibilities and accountabilities. So I don't think it's any different to anywhere else. Actually, it is. So it's standard director accountabilities. Is that quick enough, Mark?
It is, and I think we can direct people to useful reading for the duties and responsibilities of a non-exec director. I think we may have asked the question: is previous NID experience a prerequisite? Actually, for some, even some chairs in the NHS, they haven't actually been a member of the board in the NHS, so it's not fundamentally a prerequisite, unless I would say you need a clinical background, or you're needed to have been within a trust. I just wonder if we may, if there's anything else to add on top of that, but in my experience, I don't think there is.
It's definitely not a prerequisite where I am. It's actually can be seen as a bit of a training ground in some respects, but you probably wouldn't want to use it like that. But people are very open to people with different experiences coming to add some value, actually.
And I would also add to that organisations like NHS Providers, which is one of the organisations that works with the NHS, provide some fabulous training. So to Phil's point around, using it as a training ground, there's some awesome training out there around governance and compliance and committees, which will be available to you as a NED on an NHS board, which is super valuable. So, but what I would say is, what is a prerequisite is a real interest and perhaps a basic understanding of board governance, because it is pretty regulated. So as long as you've got that, or you can go and learn it, or you can do one of the Nurole programs and learn some of it, then fantastic. But you do need some of that.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to ask you a very, very tough question, which is to explain integrated care boards within 1 minute, because the question is, how are useful ideas implemented by one trust shared with another NHS trust?
I'll let Clancy do that one.
All right then. So all very broadly and basically all trusts are part of a system, which means that trusts are joined up into integrated care boards, the ICBs. The ICBs are part of the integrated care system. So within an ICB, so for example, the one I'm in, there are about 9 different trusts. They all come together. The chief executives work together. There is a committee for governance for the integrated care board, which is a separate team. Our chief medical officer is about to join that team as the chief medical officer for the integrated care board. And in that way, you are able to share ideas across different trusts. But beyond that, we are also obliged to work together. So on things like digitalization and technology, we are obliged to try and work together to create a single solution. So that is the way. The ICB is the main conduit for trusts to share ideas and work together. If you are sharing with a trust outside of your ICB, I'm not completely familiar with how that works, but actually I frankly wouldn't know how you'd have the time to do it. The ICB really is how it works. The ICS, the integrated care system, is part of how that gets shared more nationally. Does that help?
I mean, that's really, really helpful. I'll add very quickly that there are what we call models of excellence that are delivered by various trusts up and down the country. And the way that the NHS is configured is that you can learn national ideas and national, all of those things. There are opportunities to learn from different trusts, even if, several hundred miles separate you.
There is also something, just to add to that, called the model hospital approach. So there are UK national standards on how hospitals should run. It's called Model Hospitals, and that is the sort of the reference book for a lot of what we do, and that is updated by trust sharing ideas. So
thank you. There are some other questions coming through. I'm just going to take them as quickly as we can. How much time would you spend with your exec pair, i.e. Clancy and the HR director within the trust? And that, I think, excludes committee catch-ups.
So for me, I'll tell one. So I chair the Build Your Future Hospital program, which I'm building your hospital in Sutton. I would have a catch up with one member of the project team at least monthly, probably 2 or 3 members. So I would probably talk to a member of the project team every 10 days, something like that.
Yeah.
But it might be 10 minutes, might be an hour.
I link up with, we're just recruiting a new chief people officer, so we've had a gap, but I would have spoken to the previous chief people officer before he left, probably once a fortnight, on different bits and pieces. He would reach out to me, I would speak to him. He used me as a sounding board, as did his team. It was a great relationship, and that was outside of committees, but that could be, as Phil said, a 3-minute conversation. I've got this challenge, what do you think? Or it could be longer than that.
So what I'm going to do is I think I'm going to try and follow up with questions later, because I'm conscious of time. We do like to keep things running efficiently. So we'll definitely follow up with questions after this session, because I know that we've just touched 6 o'clock. So I wanted to just wrap up, if that's okay. The recording of this will be shared by all people who attended. We'll also send information on joining Nurole's Board of Communities. So that's experienced NEDs coming together to have conversations, an opportunity to learn and network with each other, where actually some of these questions and insights can be shared. And of course, if you're not a Nurole member at the moment, I mentioned we have 60,000 members. we really want to grow that because it enables clients to find even more incredible people. You can request an invitation from the website or reach out to me, and somebody asked for my email address, mark.bate@nurole.com. I'm going to leave it there. I'm going to say my warmest thanks to both Clancy and Phil for sharing an hour of their time with us today. So thank you so much. Your insights have been incredibly wonderful, and thank you.
You're very welcome.
Very welcome, Mark. It's been
thank you, Mark.
Extremely good conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
It's been great, and good luck, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.